What's up guys, Asian here again with another Wolfhunter DLC video, and today we're going to be going over what I think is going to be a at least somewhat significant change in the meta, basically, in particularly how groups are going to kind of enchant their weapons, as well as what enchants and traits you're actually going to be using, both as healers, as tanks, and as DPS. So first of all, let's just talk about what that change actually is. Now, for those of you guys who are not completely kind of caught up with past PTS cycles, you guys have just started the game, or you guys don't really pay too much attention to what goes on. In the past, before Horns of the Reach came out, so this was maybe about maybe 8 or 9 months ago. Basically, it was 2 dungeon packs ago, so about 3 or 4 DLCs ago. The Horns of the Reach came out on the PTS, and of course, this was a pretty big combat rebalance. This is when the Mundus Stones were rebalanced. This is when the Nern and all the other weapon traits were rebalanced. So there was a lot of stuff that we had to test out there. So one of the things they actually did was they changed the way basically how Infused worked. They buffed Infused a little bit, and so naturally people were, well, let's try out Torug's with an Infused enchant and see what happens. Now, there were 2 bugs that were discovered when that happened. The first one was that Torug's and the new Infused were stacking additively instead of multiplicatively, so that resulted in a enchant cooldown of 0.8 seconds instead of the proper 1.4 seconds. And the second thing that was discovered was that the back bar enchant normally does not proc while you're on your front bar, but in this particular iteration of the PTS, the back bar enchants were proccing on your front bar as long as you had a weapon ability that was a ground AoE that was going on from your back bar that was a weapon ability. So for stamina it was Endless Hail, and for Magicka it was Blockade of Storms, or at that time, or Blockade of Fire. So naturally, those two bugs combined resulted in Torug's pack really overperforming, pretty much hitting like 60k on a Magicka Nightblade. So ZeniMax came in and said, okay, this is not intended. They fixed both bugs. Now, in this current PTS patch, when they actually fixed that bug, they actually introduced a second bug, which was the Infused offhand now affected the cooldown of your main hand when you dual wield. So you kind of traded off one bug for another when they did that. And so in this particular PTS, in Wolfhunter, they managed to fix that offhand Infused bug. However, in doing so, they seem to have reintroduced, I should say, the backbar enchant proccing bug. So on live right now, if I were to use my Blockade of Fire and swap my front bar, only my front bar enchant would go off. So in this case, it would only be my oh, I see what happened there. So in this case, it would be a shock enchant. So on live right now, if I were to use Blockade on my back bar, I would not actually proc the Flame enchant. I'd be proccing the shock enchant instead when I swapped my front bar. Now on the PTS, when I use Blockade and swap my front bar, I'm actually going to get the Flame damage enchant instead of the shock damage enchant. So let me show you guys on this dummy right here. So it is actually taking the Flame enchant, not the shock enchant that's on my front bar right now. So basically what's happening is the enchant that's on your back bar is being used on your front bar because the enchant, basically the Blockade was cast while on your back bar. So if you take a look at combat metrics, you can see fiery weapon procced, but not the charged weapon that is the shock damage enchant there. However, you can actually stack them. So if I were to light attack now, you will be able to see that I have both fiery and charged weapon glyphs that went off. So we'll get out of combat and check combat metric report again, and you'll see that we have both enchants now. So basically what that means is any damage enchants and any debuff enchants on your back bar will proc while you're on your front bar as long as you had a weapon ability that was cast on your back bar. So you can see here now we have charged weapon and fiery weapon, both of them procced 4 times. Now the enchant that's on your back bar will inherit all of the traits that were on that bar when you had it. So in this case, I have an Infused Maelstrom Inferno Staff, so when I swap my front bar, the enchant will still maintain that Infused buff. So if I had like a Precise or a Nernhoned or charged front bar staff, then it would obviously gain the additional crit chance or the additional spell damage. Spell damage doesn't affect enchant damage. but it would maintain that the infused strength. So that's basically what happened with this new patch. And so at first we thought this was a bug. We were like, okay, what's going on? This is clearly a bug. But when we took a look over at on the official forums, Gina actually said that actually they did make a change how it works. So they will proc from the weapon that activated the ability. So the example she gave here was if you activate the snipe and then weapon swap to dual wield, your enchantment from your dual wield would proc. Now when you activate snipe and weapon swap, the enchant from the bow you were holding will, when you activated snipe, will fire. So this is not a bug anymore, this is actually fully intended. So now what a lot of people are saying are, or trying to test out now, is how does this influence DPS, and how does this influence healers and tanks? Because for a long time, the back bar enchant could only be procced when you're on your back bar. You can't proc it on your front bar, but now that you can proc debuff and damage enchants on your front bar now, that kind of opens up a little bit of extra play here. So what I did was I did a bunch of different tests here. So this is pretty much all the tests that I did. So I did a flame and shock enchant. So flame, the first one is going to be what's on the front bar. The second one's going to be on the back bar. So flame and shock, and then I did shock and flame. Then I did the typical flame berserker, which is what you use on live right now. Then I did a berserker front bar, flame on the back bar. Then I did flame on the front bar and absorb magic on the back bar with blue food, so that way we don't have to use witch mothers or clockwork citrus fillet. And I also did shock on the front bar, flame on the back bar with burning spellweave instead of mother's sorrow, just to kind of see what was going on there. So basically what I did was I used this build here. I just used my Magicka Nightblade, 2 pieces on, 5 pieces Aurora, 5 pieces Mother Sorrow on the front bar, and I just changed out the enchants here. So I was always used Infused on both bars. So there have been talks that charge on the front bar actually increases the concussed and burning uptime from your back bar enchant, but I didn't really play around with that too much. I also didn't play around with other traits like Nernhoned or Precise. Those might actually be worth doing now that you're pretty much guaranteed to have your back bar enchant proc all the time. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that this only affects enchants that do damage, so flame, shock, frost, disease, poison, any of the absorbed glyphs, and debuff enchants. So that would be things like crusher and weakening. This does not affect buff enchants. So if you have, for example, a weapon damage enchant on your back bar, you cast blockade and you swap to your front bar, the blockade will not proc the berserker enchant. It will not proc the weapon damage enchant because it is a buffing enchant. So that's why we tried out berserker flame, berserker on the front bar and flame enchant on the back bar, because the weapon damage enchant will only proc using light and heavy attacks. It won't proc off of weapon abilities at all. So that's why I did that test, just to kind of see whether or not that made a difference. And so one thing that you kind of had to keep in mind was the shock enchant does proc concussed. It has a 40% chance of proccing concussed, so you do have minor vulnerability uptime. So what I did was I kind of tried to control for minor vulnerability uptime. Basically what I did was I used this would definitely give you the highest minor vulnerability uptime because you always have blockade down, so you will always have your shock enchant proccing pretty much on cooldown. So we used this as a baseline. So basically I did my 5 tests, and then I averaged out how much minor vulnerability uptime we had, and then I used this value to basically correct any future parses. Now I did anyone with any parse that I used with shock enchant, I did record the minor vulnerability uptime because those were greater than like 10%, which I consider to be significant. And so basically I just kind of did a little bit of self-correction here. Same thing for flame, any of these 3. So there was a little bit of minor vulnerability coming from elemental weapon because that can proc concussed. However, it was usually within the single digits, which I consider to be pretty much negligible, so I didn't record that, and I just instead just took the full value of the average here. So for each of these different parses, I have basically 2 sets of values. I have the parse that is recorded from comment metrics, and then I have a corrected parse that takes into consideration minor vulnerability if they all had this average of about 66% minor vulnerability uptime. So Flame Shock turned out to be the strongest so far, with about 50.4k DPS. There was some bit of variation here. This had the highest parse at almost 52k. I was experiencing a little bit of lag. There has been a little bit of weird animation bugs and lag. I'm sure you saw my video about the bow animation bugs. So some of these there's going to be a little bit more variability in these parses overall. So that's Flame and Shock, which was what we thought was going to be the best in slot. Now, one thing I wanted to try out was what happens if I flipped Shock and the Flame damage enchant, because you're always want to have blockade down at all times, which means your back bar enchant is going to proc more often than your front bar enchant, particularly as a Nightblade, because you're bar swapping so often. So I thought, well, Flame enchant is typically going to be the stronger enchant because most Nightblades are Dark Elves. So I decided to swap Shock and Flame. Now this did result in lower mana vulnerability uptime, so I dropped from about 66% to about 50%, and I did end up losing DPS as a result of this. And then when you corrected for mana vulnerability, it ended up being about 50k or so. So we did lose some DPS. We lost about 400 DPS or so. So Flame Shock is still going to be the stronger combo here. Now in terms of Burning Spellweave, my thinking was, well, we have Flame Enchant proccing a lot now, which increases burning uptime. Maybe that'll help out our Burning Spellweave uptime. And the reality is it didn't really help at all. So it did end up, when you corrected for minor vulnerability, it did end up being about even with Flame Shock. However, one thing to keep in mind is that how it scales to raid buff. So in this particular, because it's a solo parse, I didn't have things like Major Force for Moorhorn. I didn't have the resource boost from Moorhorn, and critical hits generally do scale better when you have Moorhorn up. So this parse, while it is higher, will scale a little bit worse with raid buffs. So Belisar was still kind of pushing out ahead here. Then, of course, we have Flame Berserker, which pulled the lowest now. So, yeah, even after we corrected from mana vulnerability uptime, it still ended up being the worst, performing at about 48.5, 48.6k. And then we did Berserker Flame, which I thought would be a pretty good combination here. The idea being that your Flame enchant will always proc now that you have blockade down, and then your Berserker enchant will proc while you're on your front bar, and you'll have a much higher uptime on your weapon damage enchant. And that ended up being playing out pretty well here. So when we corrected for minor vulnerability, it ended up pulling about 49.8, 49.9k. And if we swap over to the Combat Metrics report here, let me see if I can find them first. So let's see here. So this one is the Flame on the front and the weapon damage on the back bar. So take a look at our weapon damage enchant uptime. It's about 65%. But when we go over to, if I can find it, I believe it is the this one here. So this parse here was with the enchants reversed. So I had the Berserker enchant on the front bar, weapon damage enchant on the front bar, and the Flame on the back bar. As you can see here, we had 89% uptime on the weapon damage enchant. So we got about 25% more uptime on the weapon damage enchant, which is about an extra 100 or so spell damage when it's all evened out. We had 51 procs on the Flame damage enchant, and here we had 43 procs on the Flame damage enchant. So we both got more procs off the fire weapon, and we got higher weapon damage uptime. So Berserker, front bar, Flame, back bar is looking to be pretty nice if you don't want to do Flame Shock. There might be some instances where you want that Berserker enchant, for example, on trash pulls where you have a lot of AoE going out. And the final one that I decided to try out, just to kind of see what would be happening, was the Flame on the front bar and the Absorb Magic on the back bar. And this time, instead of using Witch Mothers, I used Blue Food. Now the idea behind this is that now that we can have our Absorb Magic enchant proc on cooldown on the back bar, that'll help offset the loss in sustain that we lose from using Blue Food instead of Witch Mothers, and so that gains us a little bit more magic, a little bit more health, so that way we can do a little bit more DPS. And that actually ended up pulling the highest when you control for minor vulnerability. So we pulled about 50.6k when we control for minor vulnerability uptime. So this is pretty nice. And when I took a look at the Combat Metrics report here, so if we take a look, let's load up, I believe this is a Flame Shock parse. You can see here regen 1344, train 1530. And then we'll take a look at let me see if I can find it. And this is the Flame front, Absorb Magic back with the Blue Food here, right? Yeah, Blue Food. So we had 1258 drain, 1536, or 1258 regen, 1536 drain. So that's only really, that's not that big of a difference. So we lost about 100 or so regen. Strain was about the same as we could expect. So it actually ended up being pretty good overall, especially when you consider that Magicka Nightblades already have really good sustain with siphoning. So this is actually potentially a pretty good combination right here, the Flame with the Absorb Magic on the back bar. This is probably going to be stronger on something like a Sork that doesn't have quite as much sustain as a Magicka Nightblade, but even on a Magicka Nightblade, this will actually do you pretty good, and it has the benefit of you don't need to have a health enchant. You can pretty much go all Magicka enchants. You have pretty good health. So this is actually a pretty nice setup here. So that kind of surprised me a little bit because I expected this actually to perform a little bit worse, probably on par with the Berserker front bar flame back bar there. So of course, this is not quite finished yet. This is just kind of a preliminary test just to kind of see what I should kind of focus in on. One of the things now that I want to try out is, do I have to have Infused on my front bar? I'm going to try out Nern on the front bar next, and to see whether or not that might make a difference or not in DPS. Then a second thing that I've heard Massel92 suggest on the forums is charged front bar to help with minor vulnerability uptime and burning uptime. So that's kind of my plan for DPS. Now when it comes to healers and tanks, with this whole idea that now that shock enchants are probably going to be best in slot for a lot of Magicka DPS. In fact, pretty much all Magicka DPS on your back bar. They don't really need to run IA anymore. They don't need to necessarily run shock enchants anymore. So that kind of opens up another enchant slot for healers. So now they can do something like Crusher Weakening, or maybe Weakening, or Crusher. So they don't need to really run shock enchants anymore. And that also kind of removes charged now as a trait for your lightning staff, because most healers usually ran charged lightning staves with a shock damage enchant, so that way they can get better minor vulnerability uptime, concussed uptime for that off balance uptime. But if a lot of Magicka DPS are swapping over to flame shock, they don't really need that charged lightning anymore. So you might end up seeing something like double infused maybe, or maybe double decisive on healers. Also, that does open up a slot for healers. Now for tanks, this is going to be pretty useful as well in terms of maintaining Crusher uptime. Now it is possible to maintain really good debuff uptimes. The Alpha has a very good video of how we managed to maintain pretty much like high 80s, low 90% debuff uptimes on things like Alkosh, Crusher, all that stuff. So you can clearly do it, but this definitely helps out a lot of tanks that are just trying to figure out or try to learn how to maintain those uptimes, because now you can just use Blockade on your back bar and continue to proc Crusher while you're on your front bar. So this will help basically maintain those two major debuff glyphs that you will see in raid groups, so that's Crusher and Weakening. So we're going to see higher Weakening uptimes, we're going to see higher Crusher uptimes, so this is going to be pretty useful overall for both healers and tanks in terms of maintaining uptimes on those critical debuffed glyphs. So that's pretty much my preliminary findings right now for this change in glyphs, in this backbar glyph. So again, I do need to do a little bit more testing with DPS, but right now the two ones that I kind of want to focus in on, two combos I should say, are going to be Flame Front Shock Back and then Flame Front Absorb Magic Back, and obviously it'd be Shock Front and Absorb Magic Back for Sorks. So those are kind of the two enchant combinations I want to test out in a little bit more depth, as well as want to try out a couple of different front bar traits, Precise, Nerd Honed, maybe even Charge, to kind of see how that all plays out. So that is it for this video. Hope you guys found this informative. If you guys have any suggestions or tests that you want to see me do, please feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. Hope you guys found this video informative, and I will see you guys in the next dungeon.